where the value that we bring comes in is if we package all this together as a single service to provide to the hospital. That's where we really provide the value. And there's no opportunity to have that conversation in this initial process. Nobody's doing it, and really nobody's listening it or understanding. They're saying, yeah, we'll just bid on this. And if, we'll decide to put you on contract. It's like, I'm probably not going to be successful doing that.
Without supplies, there's no surgery. Without products, there's no patient care. Welcome to Power Supply, the healthcare supply chain podcast focused on helping you navigate the intricacies of logistics, purchasing, contracting, and supplier relationships. Each episode, we speak with healthcare executives, supply chain leaders, and innovative entrepreneurs from across the country as they share their stories, experience, and expertise on the industry we love. From the loading dock to strategic sourcing, from buyers to the C-suite, and across the enterprise, we tackle the real-life issues impacting the healthcare supply chain. Whether you're tuning in for conversation or inspiration, we're glad you're here. You're just in time to hear it from the source and stock up on insight. So sit back and plug into Power Supply.
On this vendor spotlight on Power Supply, we speak with Jeffrey Paquet, CEO at VERDA Water Quality Systems. This is going to be an interesting conversation today around water quality, specifically utilized in the surgical services and operations in your healthcare facilities today. Jeffrey's going to tell us why it's so important to shift from a cost savings model and when you're sourcing partners for equipment and service and water quality management and begin to look at a total management solution that can deliver true ROI. You're going to be investing a lot in water quality, and there have been some changes in the industry. Jeffrey and his team have been heavily involved in the development of an ANSI/AAMI standard ST108 that just came out not too long ago. They've got a white paper. We'll give you information on how to download that. But you'll want to make sure that your teams are compliant with this new standard and figure out where the opportunities for improvement are so that you can help avoid the rework and all of the bog downs and bottlenecks from having issues with your water quality, as well as hopefully having an impact on the reduction of surgical and site infections in your facilities today. Stay with us. Jeffrey is a wealth of knowledge, and he's up next after a short break.
From the studios of Healthcare HQ, you're listening to Power Supply.
Joining me now, Jeffrey Paquet, CEO at VERDA Water Quality Systems. And Jeff, we've talked before, but not on Power Supply. We've talked on some of the other podcasts in the family, including Beyond Clean, and we've got an upcoming interview on our First Case podcast with the operating room as well. But you've been around in this space for a while. You're heavily involved in water quality, healthcare, even guidelines and standards, and we're going to get into all of that today. But I want to welcome you to the Power Supply podcast, and thank you so much for coming on.
Great, thanks. I'm really excited about being able to talk to this audience. It's not an audience I get to talk to a lot, at least up till now, so exciting.
Well, I think it's important because we're going to be talking a lot about ROI today versus just a simple cost savings approach. And so we'll dive into all of that, but I think it's an important discussion for the healthcare supply chain. And I thought maybe first you could just talk a little bit about your background and how you came to be the CEO at VERDA.
Sure. I actually got my start in aerospace engineering. I worked in the space program for a while in my younger years. I also worked for some of the commercial companies doing commercial aircraft and other things. So I've been heavily influenced by my design background as well as my manufacturing background, that dealing with sort of large systems and large organizations, how they function. And so mainly because I wanted to work with small companies, I eventually found my way through several different iterations of what I was doing with my skill set to be CEO of a company that was in the healthcare space. And we recognized early on in some of the work that we were doing that hospitals were really struggling with managing water properly. And what we saw was that they were experiencing a significant cost across the organization that wasn't necessarily being realized in the cost center where they were doing the purchasing. So
they didn't have the total picture. They had all these little pieces that were almost like symptoms showing up in different areas, but not all wrapped up into like the full story.
Right. We stepped back and said all of these things should be together and related and sort of managed under one umbrella. But the current paradigm, including the current supply chain, they're all sort of separate into discrete little silos. And unless you have somebody who can tie them together, they don't work well for you.
It's kind of why we have the family of podcasts. It's very similarly, like we'll see different departments in the hospital working in silos. And we really wanted to, kind of have the family of podcasts with overlapping content and some collaboration there. And I can hear that is really important to your message. It's like you say, I don't get to talk to supply chain very often, but I know they're a very important part of pulling all of this together. And what is unique and that I really enjoy about supply chain is that while many other departments might be siloed, supply chain has to contact all of those departments and have a relationship with all of those departments. And so I think, your perspective on how to put the full picture into focus, I think is going to be really, really good today. I even want to back up and say, let's tell everybody about VERDA and what it is exactly that the company does. And you were kind of starting to tell the story, like we started to realize this with another company. And so maybe like tell that story a little bit about, how it's like, wait a second, I've got to create this because there is nothing in the industry today to do it.
Right. So the parent company got its start in the mobile surgery business. Our company introduced the first licensable ambulatory surgery centers that were mobile in the United States. And so we did that successfully for a number of years and learned a lot. Of course, we were right in the most technical aspect of facilities engineering for the healthcare setting, an operating room. So we learned a lot about healthcare, understood a lot about compliance, and we did it in, the majority of states across the United States with multiple authorities having jurisdiction. So a lot going on there. We eventually were continue to see requests for mobile sterile processing. So we introduced the first mobile sterile processing unit to the United States. Over the years now, we now have a fleet of these mobile sterile processing units. And during the course of doing mobile sterile processing, and this was quite a number of years ago, they were beginning to ask us about supplying water because they couldn't supply what people call RODI water in the parking lot, which is where they put us, or in the loading dock or something like that in our big tractor trailer there. So we had to do it. And initially it was approached from a sales standpoint. It was before I came to the company, and we very quickly ran into some trouble, meaning that we realized that we weren't really understanding how complex this was. And what we found, which is what I think everybody finds in the hospital setting, is the people you think that are supposed to know about this, your vendors, your water vendor, they don't really understand your job. They only understand what their equipment does. They're not really interested in being a partner with you to help you deal with your day-to-day problems that you might have with water. And we also found that unless you ask for it specifically, specifically, they're not going to go out of their way to do something different for you. So if you don't know what you're asked to ask for specifically, often you won't get what you need. So they're not really consultative in many different ways. So we found this a big problem. Are you saying
you almost need to be an engineer to have
right, exactly. And luckily, we were a facilities engineering company. So we consider ourselves kind of the NASA of healthcare. So we take healthcare and put it in something that's mobile. We really understood. We decided to back up and really understand this from an engineering standpoint, really looked at the current standard, which at that time was TIR 34, and said, wow, people are just not doing this. They're struggling with this. We're going to do it for ourselves and our customers, and we're going to manage it ourselves, because we turned management over to the people that the hospitals turn it over to, and we got the same results the hospitals get, which was, not satisfactory. So we did it ourselves.
What were you concerned about? Like, you're reprocessing these instruments, right? So like, what was the main concern with not having the good control over the water quality? Because I'll say this, I was a nurse. My first sales job was for a company that supported sterile processing. But prior to that, I always just kind of thought like, yeah, well, the instruments, you super cook them in, steam or you bathe them in chemicals, and they just come out, magically sterile. And I obviously kind of know some of the answers to this question based on my experience, which is I quickly learned that wasn't true. But your company was becoming a big part of the hospital's surgical operations because you were managing this in a mobile setting. And so I can see why you would expect to be able to control the quality coming from your company. So what were you concerned about? Like, for the supply chain audience, what are the factors at play for not having good managed water quality?
Right. Well, foremost, it starts at the top of the tree, which is patient safety. Right. And the whole reason you have sterile processing is to ensure patient safety. And sterile processes only work if everything happens the way it's supposed to happen. And, if you know anything about sterile processing, you realize that most of sterile processing occurs in and around water. And so almost all your instruments will be touched by water at some time. And the equipment and the chemicals that are used to process instruments, including the sterilizers, all operate under the assumption that you have done the process before it correctly, and that if you're using water, it's within this sort of narrow band of specification. So the problem we were having is we were discovering that even though we thought we asked for the right thing, we weren't getting the water the way we needed it. And then we would never find out until a month later or 2 months later. And now you've already processed instruments. Those instruments have already been used in surgery. When you're a vendor held to a contractual standard, obviously we have to meet the standards of our contract. And if we said we were going to produce water to this standard, we were very concerned that we would be able to do that. So we just said we have got to understand this problem better than the industry does so that we can do our job correctly.
Well, the financial pressures on healthcare, and I say this, too often these days on the Power Supply podcast, but they've really never been greater. It's just an immense amount of financial pressure. And one thing that we know since the beginning of the Accountable Care Act is that surgical site infections wind up impacting the hospital's finances pretty significantly when people are readmitted within 30 days with a surgical site infection, or really a nosocomial infection, but just keeping this to the surgical site infections. And I think it goes out even further, 6 months, if it's related to an implant. Then the hospital's really footing the bill, or worse yet, they go to a competing healthcare organization in your market and you pay list price or whatever it is for them to get the care to follow up on the infection somewhere else. So obviously it's important for hospitals to keep these patients kind of within their network, but also to avoid, having to do or having to incur the cost of, kind of taking care of an infection that might have been preventable. And you're right. Like, the water quality has a big influence. It's a big factor on sterility of the instruments. And in many cases, steam sterilization is the most frequently used form of sterilization. And it's obviously water, right? And
it is water.
Not to mention the impact on the life of your instruments too, like patient's number one. But I can't tell you how many times in my role I ran into hospitals that were like, now we have this staining issue. We can't tell if it's baked on blood or bioburden or if it's a staining. It's really slowing down our operation and we have no idea how to fix it. We don't even know what to do. And that would come up very often. I'm assuming you were experiencing those same challenges until you took control of the water.
Right. And even if you do everything right with water, you can still have those issues. But if you are doing the right things with water and you have the ability to prove that you're doing that by doing all the correct monitoring, then at least you can eliminate that major source and water contains at least 18 variables that can throw off your processing. So if you can eliminate that from your root cause and determining where the staining comes in, that goes a long way to getting to the root cause of the problem and eliminating it very quickly.
You know, we're going to get into the ROI discussion here in just a couple of minutes. I think we need to talk about really what's separating you from the others, but I want to kind of introduce this concept as we're talking about, you know, maybe some differentiators for, you know, the clinical teams, what it means to have a total water quality management solution in place. But, and I also want to talk a little bit about the standards that you've helped influence. I know you mentioned the TIR, but I think the thing that we really need to emphasize as we get into this is that, you know, in the past, it's really presented a challenge, not only, you know, for you, but also for supply chain, because as a result of not having a total management solution and everything sort of being siloed in all of these pieces, that supply chains typically take in a cost savings perspective versus developing a full ROI strategy. And I think that's really where you come into place here, is to, like, instead of segmenting all these commodities, you build a value-based approach by pulling all of those, you know, sort of separate pieces of the puzzle into one good, clear picture. Maybe you could talk a little bit more, like, when you have been in front of supply chain, like, what's that? What have those conversations been like historically that you kind of knew that you needed to bring this forward?
Right. Well, when you're trying to, you know, a typical thing is if you're trying to break into a group purchasing organization, they'll hand you the spreadsheet of all the different contracts that are coming up and they tell you to bid on one. And that's about the conversation you're going to have at that level, unless you're being sponsored by some organization that really wants to put you on contract. But if you go a normal route through that, I see like a bunch of different things that I could bid on. However, where the value that we bring comes in is if we package all this together as a single service to provide to the hospital, that's where we really provide the value. And there's no opportunity to have that conversation in this,
because nobody else is doing process. It.
Nobody's doing it, and really nobody's listening it or understanding. They're saying, yeah, we'll just bid on this, and if, you know, we'll decide to put you on contract. It's like, I'm probably not going to be successful doing that.
You know, a lot of supply chains are looking to consolidate their point of contact because they're getting so much bigger. So I think this is kind of an obvious opportunity if you're kind of hearing the way that it's set up today. But one of the things that you're talking about, you know, in our traditional sourcing models is that if you don't have a competitor, then how could you possibly have structure for a bid that helps change the paradigm? And so I can see why you would want to present this to this audience as sort of like, if we're the only ones with this that take this approach, we have nothing to bid against.
Right. And, you know, the reason we aren't going to be successful by bidding against other little pieces of it is because, you know, those people provide just this. That's all they do. And it's a commodity. They provide it to you. And a typical scenario might be is you want to get lab results from a testing lab. And they'll do that, and they'll probably do that for reasonable money. But when you say, what does this mean? They're all, hey, we just test it. We don't know. We don't know what it means. You got to figure it out.
So then they've got to engage either another third party, and they also have to figure out who they have to communicate the information to based on the assessment of the third party. So yeah, I can see where you're not really wrapping that all up together. All right. So let's talk about some differentiators for VERDA. Let's start with like clinical. As you've worked with, again, many different departments, somewhat siloed conversations at times, what have you kind of centralized your conversations around that really matter to the clinical teams when they start thinking about this total approach?
Right. Well, I think this is where we sort of get into that ROI discussion a little bit, because I think that the teams on the clinical side understand because, and there's a lot to unpack here really. But so I think the first thing we should, when we talk about RODI, think ROI. Let's shorten that up a little bit because, so just think ROI.
Quick, reverse osmosis or deionized water. That's really,
right. Instead, we're just going to talk about ROI, which is return on investment. But, yeah. But in order to manage water, it takes a lot of moving pieces. So when you don't have somebody that knows what they're doing that, it kind of falls back onto somebody in the hospital. So who is that? Is it the SPD department? What do they know about managing water? They understand using the water, but they're not water experts. It may be facilities engineering, but facilities engineering is really focused heavily on things that are regulatory. They may have the skill set to do some of this, but like every other department, if they don't have to do it, they won't do it, or they can only do it to a limited extent. And then a lot of times it may fall to biomed, and again, not water experts. Could fall to infection prevention, not water experts. So who ties it all together? So that's a kind of the fundamental problem that, people are beginning to see. And it's particularly acute because in August of 2023, they released a new standard, and it's now a standard. So people are taking it more seriously, and everybody is going, whose job is this to help us implement this? Who's going to manage it, right? Everybody's doing that. And so the return on investment on the clinical side really begins in the sterile processing department. Number one is managing water is a lot of work. Keeping track of the vendor, make sure they're showing up on time, make sure they're doing the right thing, making sure the results are interpreted. This takes time. So if you're doing that, you are not processing instruments. You are not turning over RO time in terms of, or OR time in terms of occupancy and production in your ORs. We want to get down to the business end of hospitals. And if you are not managing water well, then you are probably having quality problems with your instruments and processing. So as we all, if we put on our manufacturing hats, we understand that quality is a non-value added process. We always say in manufacturing, you build quality into the process so you don't have quality problems, so you don't need this massive quality control infrastructure, which is what we have in SPD. We're at the tables, we're inspecting the instruments, and the more problems you have, the more administrative and logistical time is spent dealing with the problems as you manage, identify them, categorize them, catalog them, send them out to be repaired, refurbished, or dealt with. Then they've got to come back. They have to be re-inspected. They have to be reprocessed and then sent back to the OR. So by eliminating water issues in the department or minimizing them, you essentially create more capacity in that department without buying capital equipment or adding additional human resources. So there's a huge ROI there, particularly in an area of the hospital. Not that all areas of the hospitals don't have problems staffing, but that is an area that has a lot of trouble staffing. So you don't need to find new staff. You just need to do water better. And then if you can process more instruments, you can do more procedures and operations. If you can do more procedures and operations, then you significantly increase the profitability of the healthcare organization. And not only that, you're doing it with less surgical site infections. So there's less cost of goods on on those activities.
Yeah, I can see how this impacts case delays too, right? Because if there is an issue with the water, especially if it's in the steam, once they put the lid on and put it into the steam sterilizer, you're not going to know until you open the set and start setting up for the case. And then all of a sudden we've got an issue here. We've got to call for another set. And then that can wind up having downstream impacts because set availability could cause case delays, right? And so
particularly if they require special instruments that are loaner sets, and loaner sets are the sets that we typically see have problems because they've been passed around from place to place with various degrees of water problems and other problems. So they show up to you with an unknown provenance, right?
Yeah.
So
it's a really good point. It's like, you can only control what happens within your walls, but the loaner,
but you're bringing in
assignment trays, yeah, right, because they're being used in these other different areas, and you don't control the processes necessarily in those settings. So, I think the lesson is you always got to try to control to the best of your ability what you can kind of control. And so, we'll talk a little bit about, just kind of your presence across the country and the different types of things that you do. But let's just continue the ROI discussion because, we kind of talked about how supply chain in the past may have taken more of a cost savings approach. And you detailed, kind of like what that line item bid might look like in the past. But can you expand on that and exactly like how this is managed and evaluated, in a deeper dive related to the cost savings, kind of building off what you said before?
Right. Well, in order to get the ROI, you need, what we have done is unify a lot of the services and equipment needs under one umbrella. So the things you need to do to manage water well is you need to have a well-designed system, and not only a well-designed system for delivering RO water and the utility water at the sinks, but also the plumbing in the department, how it's plumbed to the equipment is also very important. And as you can see, when you don't have somebody watching over that's a partner, like when you renovate a department or you want to improve a department, it always falls back on the hospital. Is the plumber going to go around and figure out all the problems you have? Now, plumbers don't know. They know how to plumb stuff. They know the codes, but they don't know anything about, how plumbing and biofilms intersect and how it can be impacted simply by a couple of decisions made by a plumber on site when they're plumbing up your sink.
That's a great point about the biofilms. I mean, that's huge. And I'm also thinking about this equipment, right? Like you're talking about the maintenance around the equipment, but when they go out to bid for the equipment, like is the person or is the company that's winning this bid for the equipment, are they also typically doing the service? And are there any issues with that?
So typically a company that provides the equipment will do the service on it. However, pretty much what they do will stop in the little closet where they've provided that equipment. And remember, they're just providing the RO DI portion, the final rinse water, what we call critical water in ST108. They're just providing that piece of it. That's maybe 10 or 20% of the water you use in the department. ST108 covers all the rest of the water that you use in the department for soaking and for washing and in the ultrasonic and those type of things. That water needs to be monitored and managed too, but not my job. That we provided the equipment, we'll maintain this equipment. The other thing is that, the first thing I always tell customers when we talk to them for the first time is, the reason you want to work with us is because we're a healthcare company. We're not a water company. We're a healthcare company that developed an expertise in water, and we understand your timelines. We understand your code environment, the way you perform your quality control functions in the IP area. We understand this is all important to you, and whatever services we provide need to be provided on the timelines you need them with the responsiveness that you need them. And we can do all that because we're a healthcare company. These other people, they're really trades contractors.
Yeah. That is an important difference to make note of. It's like a lot of times they don't understand the healthcare environment, and you understand not only the healthcare environment, but specifically surgical services, because of the service that you were delivering through the parent company is like a major component of the life cycle of instrument reprocessing.
Right. So, example might be we went and visited a surgical center. We were gowning up to go in there, and they were saying, well, let's go into decon. And I said, well, you think maybe we should go to sterile first? We'll go through sterile, and then we'll go to decon, because then we don't have to come back out and unsuit and resuit and go into decon.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, that's a good idea. Yeah, good idea.
Right, because you can't follow the instruments after you've been in decon, right?
Yeah, you can't go to. You'd be surprised that not everybody is really keen on that, and particularly people that are trades contractors, and they'll just walk.
Yeah, they'll
wherever.
just put the booties on and flow through the whole system. And the truth is, once you've been in decon, those booties got to come off before you go into prep and pack or sterile storage or anything like that. That's a really, really good point. And let me kind of take us to like, how should they be approaching this? I mean, I think you've set the table for this really well. It's just, that coordinated effort, right? But again, it may be very foreign in the way that they've ever packaged up an RFP in the past, or how they've structured, any kind of sourcing initiative. So, what are your tips for like, how do you break the commodity approach and move to a more value-based approach in this space?
Right. Well, I think, and believe it or not, the VA is catching on and doing a pretty good job of it in some places, beginning to put together solicitations that are really focused on providing the equipment and services that are needed to support compliance with AAMI ST108. So there's a litany of things that somebody who is going to be working with you on water that have to be done for you in that standard. The best way to solicit it is to kind of look at the services that you need in that standard. And those services primarily are going to be water testing and laboratory work for both the utility and the critical water. You're going to need somebody to maintain equipment at the very least, the RODI equipment on a regular basis. You're going to need somebody who is going to be able to disinfect that equipment on a regular basis, as well as the critical water plumbing in your department needs to be disinfected on a regular basis. And then ideally, you'd like to have somebody who can provide the equipment as well. And to top that off, you would really like them to have enough expertise so that when they call you, not when you call them with a problem, when they call you and say, hey, we've been monitoring the water, we have something that's going south here, this is what we need to do collectively, we need your facilities department to do this, we're going to do this, and then we're going to take care of this problem, and then they call you back up and say, we took care of the problem. That's what you need. You don't need somebody looking at a report that's 3 months old going, gee, we've got a problem. What do we do? I don't know. What does facilities say? Facilities doesn't know what to do. Where's the vendor? Where's the vendor for the equipment? Well, they came in 2 months ago, and I called them, but they haven't been back in here.
I can see where, as you put kind of your sourcing, maybe it's an RFQ, maybe it's an RFI, as you're putting that together, you've really got to understand the standard and all the key components, so that if you're going to do this, you got to figure out like where are going to be the gaps. If you're not going to do an all-in-one, which is clearly what you have, then you need to figure out where the gaps are so that you're not out of compliance with ST108, and that you've got all the pieces of the puzzle. And then somebody's going to have to manage that from a project standpoint, because it requires coordination if you don't have an all-in-one total.
Yeah, it's a 3-ring circus, and somebody has to have their eyeballs on it. And, some people are really great at multitasking, but I'm not one of them. So, I have to pull myself out of one problem to go deal with some other problem I was supposed to be dealing with on a regular basis. And it's like, oh, that's right. I got to look at the water report. And then there's a problem, and it's like, oh, there goes my day.
So Jeffrey, I am really good at multitasking, but it doesn't cure the circus. It just means I'm a little more comfortable at the circus. I want to dive into ST108 because I know like we have the ability for folks to download a white paper that you put together. And I do want to emphasize, how your organization and you and the employees have really contributed significantly to the improvements that were laid out in the ANSI/AAMI Standard 108. But first, I think it's just important to mention, sometimes people are like, wait, is this a regional company? Is this a national company? So I know you're in all 50 states. I think it's important to note or just emphasize what you sort of said is like, not only can you collect the information on the water to get the data points, but then you can outline corrective actions as well. Do you ever have a problem supporting, these large health systems that have just multiple sites throughout, a region or even, multiple states?
Right. So, luckily we cut our teeth managing entire facilities all over the country. So we're very good at risk management around when things go sideways, because things will go sideways. And so we always have a support network behind us of additional contractors that we can work with, that if for some reason our on-site regional guy can't get there, that we have some backup. And then because we've been involved with the trades on the construction side, when we put facilities into hospitals, and this is on the mobile side, we're very comfortable working with trades contractors to direct them with scopes of work to go in and fix something if for some reason we couldn't do it and it needed to be done right away. So we're very good at that.
So it sounds to me like you provide the equipment, but all right. So if you're providing the equipment, what if they already bought equipment somewhere else? Can they still work with you?
Yes, they can. We can maintain other people's equipment. It's important for people to understand, I think, that complying with the standard is really a journey more than it is an end. So if you have a current department, it's likely you're not in current equipment. It's likely that the equipment that you have bought, the RODI equipment, and the way your department is even plumbed may not be completely compliant. So your first step really is to make an assessment of where you are with regards to where you would need to be compliant, and then knock down those things. You can make quick modifications for the RODI equipment, may have some things you can do to it to make it a little bit more compliant, add some sampling ports, do something. But eventually, you're probably going to want to replace that equipment anyway. So if we're there maintaining it, obviously, we already understand you as a customer. It's very easy to bring in our equipment behind it when it's time for you to do that.
Yeah. I'm just thinking about your RODI analogy. And it's almost like you can demystify this by removing the D and finding the ROI.
Yeah, exactly.
RODI.
Exactly.
And I'm almost thinking like from a sourcing perspective, like a trigger for me, I think would be, okay, we've got this contract for the equipment, but we're going to look and see, do we actually have a service agreement, or are we just using the equipment provider to provide the service? And then if there is some sort of, term on that agreement, that service agreement, what a great place to start by saying, okay, we either need an agreement for service or we have an expiring agreement for service. And then whatever that is, we then go out to RFP or whatever it's going to be on the service. But we look at ST108 and we look at what those requirements are and we build that into the service. So it's not just an equipment service RFP. We start to build in all the requirements of ST108 so that whatever that RFP is, it's a more robust look at it. But maybe the service contract is the trigger to like start that sort of, value analysis process.
Right. Just to kind of give people an idea of how to get started, the way we often get started with customers is they'll call us asking about, how do we become compliant? We have a current department. We're thinking about a project in 2 years. We want to make sure we do it right, but we got to do something.
When you say project, I didn't mean to interrupt, but when you say project, you mean renovation.
Renovation,
right? Renovation.
Yeah. Okay. Or they just want to become compliant. So what we usually do is we usually do a project with them where we will come on site for a day. We will do what we call a water quality survey, which we take the basically 18 parameters that you look at, and then ST108 for qualification. And we test some relevant areas where we can test in the department at the water generation equipment, at the sink, some other places that are easy to get water. We'll also go through, as much as we can see, your entire department, how it's plumbed, how you're using water, what your behavior is around it. We'll assess the current system you have, take a look at its capacity versus what you need now, and that type of thing. And then we usually come back with about a 30-page report with what we found and short-term and long-term actions that you can take to become more compliant. And then we offer generally to say, we could help you through some of this, and we could start by just doing routine testing of your water. Right. And that's how we begin with them. Then after gaining their confidence or whatever, after them finding some of the value in us reporting them to them on a monthly basis on their water and explaining to them what it means and explaining how we're going to take care of this problem or how the problem needs to be dealt with, then we usually pick up some other services up to and including taking over the preventive maintenance on their current system. And that's kind of how we back into it many times.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. And, I kind of want to just use that as an opportunity to let everybody know, like, going through and reading an ANSI Amy standard might not be like, what you would find to be the most enjoyable thing to do with your free time when you're not on back-to-back calls in supply chain.
Right.
So one of the things, Jeffrey, that you and your team have done is you created a white paper on this to sort of like really distill this down into like, what do you need to know and what is important? And so you've got this white paper. We're going to have the link in the description for this episode so that everybody can read that and kind of understand it. But again, to your point, if your organization is not clear on whether or not you're complying with the new standard, this will help you kind of, get the high level overview of what's really important so that you can start that self-assessment. And then, Jeff, since you and the team were just so involved, in developing the standard, like what are some main, like as we're kind of wrapping up here, what are some really key highlights of things that are typically not in place today? Like maybe 3 things that health systems where they're commonly not complying that anybody who's listening could just quickly get a heat check on it and then download the white paper to go further.
Probably one of the biggest ones is if you go in your department and first of all is check to see that your critical water is in a circulating loop, that it doesn't just come from the equipment in the closet and go directly to the piece of equipment and end there, but actually goes back to the equipment in the closet if it's not used to be reprocessed, essentially just like instruments to be re-disinfected.
So is that because the piping has an influence over the water quality as it's circulating through the system?
Yeah. Everything the water touches is a potential area for contamination. Bacteria produces asexually, just takes 1 to get 10 million. And if water just sits around for any length of time without being used, it will become significantly infected with bacteria. So it needs to be continuously treated as it comes back to the system. So, and to go further with that, if indeed you do have a loop, congratulations. But it does not end there. What we see in probably every department we've been into is most of the time the loop is up in the ceiling. And then they will have a feed that will snake down, or even if the loop does come down out of the ceiling and then go back up in the other piece of the equipment, you've got this long coil of braided hose that connects the loop to a sink or to a washer called a service loop. And that service loop generally should be about this long. Usually they're 6 feet long. And that is an area.
It should be like 3 or 4 inches.
Yeah. Yeah. It's supposed to be no longer than like 6 times the diameter of the hose.
Yeah. Okay.
That is an area where water stagnates. And even if it sits for 3-4 hours, say, overnight, when you turn on that critical water fixture at the sink, you're just blasting yourself with bacteria because bacteria has developed in that area overnight. And then what happens once bacteria sits around for a while, it dies. And as it dies, it adheres to the walls of the pipe and that becomes a biofilm. And bacteria can attach itself and hide in biofilms. And once biofilms become established, it becomes very, very tough to combat any type of elevated levels of bacteria in your plumbing. And it doesn't just affect that fixture. Eventually it gets stirred up, breaks off, and heads to your other fixtures where it's off to do more damage. So,
yeah, I did a lot of educational sessions for sterile processing in the OR on biofilms back in the day. And I think one thing that people just may not even realize is that the way biofilms work is they create this protective coating, almost like a dome colony, if you want to get a visualization of it. But it also becomes incredibly resistant to sterilization. So if you have that biofilm and it's getting on the instruments as you're reprocessing them and it's not removed, the bacteria may actually still be alive, even though the steam sterilization process is supposed to kill it, which does become, when we tie this whole conversation back to surgical site infections and how that impacts, the finances of healthcare. That's something that I think sometimes is underrated about and definitely ties into our conversation today.
And for the third point and related to that is, and this is something a lot of departments don't do, is you really should be disinfecting that loop every month.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I definitely did not know that.
Yeah, it should. And it's a prophylactic thing for the exact reason that you said. The disinfectant has the ability to strip out some biofilm because it's peracetic acid, which degrades.
It's high level disinfection chemical.
Yeah.
And
it's usually mixed with some, like hydrogen peroxide. So it has the ability to actually strip the biofilm with the acid and kill the bacteria with the hydrogen peroxide. However, it becomes less and less effective as you have more and more biofilm buildup. So if you go a year without disinfecting, you may be able to remove some of the biofilm that's built up, but there's a chance you're not going to remove it all, and you're going to get less of it next year and less of it the year after, and pretty soon you just can't get rid of any problems you have.
Wow. Jeffrey, this has been a really, really fun conversation today, and I think not a lot of people know a lot about water, but you certainly do. And I want to congratulate you and the entire team at VERDA for being involved in the development of the standard through ANSI and Amy, because I just think there was a lot kind of, behind the curtain or within the pipes, so to speak, that people just weren't aware of. And so I think shining a light on that as an industry and for the industry is really, really critical. It's a great starting point. I do want to let everybody know that if they want to reach out and learn more, they can call your toll-free number, 800-748-2322. They can also send an email to info@verdawater.com. That's VERDA water.com. Jeffrey, anything you want to add that we might have missed during the conversation before we wrap up here? Really enjoyed this discussion today.
Well, I think it's important to note, I think one of the other things that we bring to the table with our equipment is we've introduced some state-of-the-art monitoring technology that sort of comes out of building monitoring as well as manufacturing, where when I began the conversation about how do you build quality into the process, it's by making sure your process variables are in spec. So our equipment is set up to look at itself every 2 seconds to make sure everything is functioning properly, with the idea if the equipment is functioning properly, you're going to get good water. If it is not functioning properly, it notifies us right away. So to the ROI discussion, it's better to head off a problem before it happens than to deal with it months later after it's happened and you've discovered it. So I think that's another thing that we bring to the table.
Yeah, being proactive in the healthcare space is it's so important and sometimes elusive. So I can see where you're a huge part of that.
Comes from my aerospace days where you don't want to have to take corrective action once you've hit the mountain. It's not good.
Yeah, literally on the fly, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Try to fly the plane while you're building it, so to speak.
Exactly.
Yeah. All right, Jeffrey, thanks so much for coming on the show, and really enjoyed it. And
I really enjoyed it. Great conversation.
That was Jeffrey Paquet, CEO at VERDA Water Quality Systems, talking about having a total management solution in place for the water that is heavily used in healthcare, specifically in surgical services. I know that's what really had Jeffrey and the team there develop VERDA Water so that we could handle this kind of challenge in a more holistic approach. But I can see where this can be a challenge for sourcing teams to figure out like, hey, when do we initiate an RFP and how would we do this differently to look at it holistically? So I think a great start, like we talked about, is taking a look at ST108. You can definitely download the white paper that VERDA Water has put together for you. That link is going to be in the description of the podcast. You can give them a call, 800-748-2322. You can visit their website, verdawater.com. That's VERDA water.com, or send them an email to info@verdawater.com. Really enjoyed the conversation today, and always respect having the opportunity to speak with somebody who's doing their best to shape the industry and improve standards and the way that we deliver care so that we're not finding all of these hidden causes for surgical site infections, which do hit the hospital's finances pretty strongly. So that's going to do it for this vendor spotlight. Thank you very much to Jeffrey Paquet, CEO at VERDA Water Quality Systems, and to all of you out there for listening today.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Power Supply. As a reminder, you can help support us by subscribing on your favorite podcast app or by downloading the smartphone app on your iPhone or Android. Simply search for Power Supply in the App Store or Google Play. The best thing about downloading the smartphone app is that you can access bonus content for certain episodes and view episodes in certain categories, like articles on the go and vendor spotlights. Are you following us on LinkedIn or Facebook yet? If you are and you love an episode or post, then let your social network know about it. Like, comment, or share our posts along with your thoughts and keep the conversation going. If you have any topics or guests that you would like to recommend for a future episode, just send us an email to info@powersupplymedia.net. We look forward to hearing from you.